Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. I'm sorry for the delay and thank you for your waiting. Even though the internet quality still has some problem, but we are trying to solve it. And let's keep our fingers crossed to see whether we can smoothly proceed this meeting. And we have asked the interpreters to extend 1 more hour until 2 p.m. to catch up the lost hour of this meeting. And we hope if this causes any inconvenience to you, please accept our apology and thank you for your understanding. And we have talked to the restaurant of the WTO to extend 30 minutes more, which means that they can extend the operation time until 2:30 p.m. So we can still have lunch in the cafeteria if you like. So let's start our meeting. Thank you. I would like to welcome all participants to this thematic session on the international standards and best practices in pest risk identification, assessment, and management. This topic was proposed by the EU and was agreed upon by the SPS committee in the November 2021 meeting. I'm very thankful to everyone who has been involved in the organization of this thematic session, in particular the Secretariat, IT team, the video conference, and conference teams, as well as the interpreters who will be covering today's event. Kindly note that this thematic session is taking place in person and via Zoom, with interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. Interpretation can be accessed by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and choosing your preferred language. You have information on how to access the different interpretation channels in the welcome message that was just put on the chat. Please note that you should switch to English only when needed. Otherwise, select off if the speaker is already speaking in English. On behalf of the interpreters, I would also highlight the following recommendations. When participating remotely, please use an external USB tabletop microphone or a lapel microphone. Avoid using your computer's built-in microphone or cell phone earbuds. This will ensure that everyone can hear and understand your intervention fully. The Secretariat and I will try to ensure that we capture the requests for the floor, both from those physically in the room and those joining via Zoom. We will attempt to give delegations the floor on the first-come, first-served basis. Let me now highlight a few technical instructions. For those of you participating virtually through Zoom, to request the floor, please press the Raise Hand button, which you may find under the Reactions icon. When several participants request the floor, I will name the next speakers in advance, and we will enable their microphones and their cameras. Please keep your microphones on mute at this point. Only turn on your microphones when you are given the floor. Once you have finished speaking, click the mute button. Please note that it will be difficult for the Secretariat at the head table to assist with technical queries during the meeting. So I would encourage you to contact the technical team to use the email address that is shown on your screens. Before we start, let me remind you that the thematic session is being webcast live on the WTO website. The recording will be made available in the original language on the WTO website following the event. Moving now to the substance of our discussions. Let me first recall that the EU submitted a proposal for the committee to consider holding a thematic session on international standards and best practices in pest risk identification, assessment, and management. The relevant document was circulated as document Jan/1951 and subsequently revised. At the November 2021 meeting, the SPS committee agreed that the thematic session will be held in November 2022. The final program contained in the document G/SPS/Jan/2069/Ref1 was circulated on November 3, 2022. It builds on the EU proposal and incorporates comments and suggestions received from members. In terms of the structure of the event today and the various topics that will be explored, in the first session, the Secretariat will present on relevant provisions of the SPS agreement and work of the SPS committee. In session 2, speakers will provide insights on the relevant standards developed by the IPPC and explore the use of pest risk analysis as a tool to enable trade whilst ensuring plant health protection. This session will also highlight the importance of plant health and trade in supporting food security. Following this, in session 3, members will present case studies regarding best practices in pest risk identification, assessment, and management. In session 4, members, industry representatives, and representatives from international intergovernmental organizations will exchange practical experiences and case studies in the application of pest risk management in trade, and explore the use of reference databases and tools developed by the international intergovernmental organizations. Finally, Session 5 will bring together panelists in a panel discussion to exchange experiences and discuss the challenges, opportunities, and best practices related to pest risk identification, assessment, and management, as well as explore the need for further IPPC guidance. Throughout the thematic session, I will open the floor for questions and answers. Let me also draw your attention to the full program we have today and kindly request speakers to try to stay within the allocated presentation time. First, relevant provisions of the SPS agreement and work of the SPS committee. Let me first give the floor to Mr. Rolando Alcala from the Secretariat, who will provide an introductory presentation on plant health and relevant provisions of the SPS agreement and work of the SPS committee. Rolando, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning all here in the room in Geneva, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those connecting via Zoom. Next. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide you with a brief overview of the SPS agreement and work of the SPS committee from the plant health perspective. Next. So we can start with the objective of the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, commonly referred to the SPS agreement. So what is the objective, or what is the raison d'être of the SPS agreement? So the agreement recognizes members' right to adopt measures necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health on the condition that these measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between members where the same sanitary and phytosanitary conditions prevail, or are not applied in a manner which will constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. So we like to use this image of the scale. So furthermore, we can highlight that the preamble of the SPS agreement recognizes one of the primary objectives of the SPS agreement is to further the use of harmonized sanitary and phytosanitary measures between members on the basis of international standards, guidelines, and recommendations developed by the relevant international organizations. So in other words, the SPS agreement, negotiated under the auspices of the WTO, provides governments with the means to establish a framework to facilitate safe trade based on internationally agreed standards for plant health, as well as for food safety and animal health. Next. Next. Yeah, thank you. So now let's have a look at the coverage. What are SPS measures? So what is covered by the SPS agreement? What is the definition of SPS measures? So these are any measures that are applied to mitigate any of the 4 objectives identified in Annex A of the agreement. So for plant health, the relevant objectives are the first and last one on this slide. So it will be, if I read the first one, any measures taken to protect plant life or health from risk arising from the entry, establishment, or spread of pests, diseases, disease-carrying organisms, or disease-causing organisms. So, for example, a measure to prevent the introduction of fruit fly in your territory. And the last objective is or any measure that is taken to prevent or limit other damage within the territory of the member from the entry, establishment, or spread of pests. And here, for example, we can think of seed regulations to avoid introduction of exotic weeds, or measures to prevent introduction of zebra mussels or any other pest, exotic pest, in the ballast water of ships, for example. So it is worth noting that plant includes forest and wild flora, and pests include weeds in this definition. Next, thank you. Yeah, so here I'm not going to go into the details of each of these provisions, but here you have summarized the key provisions or principles of the SPS agreement. And of course, all of these provisions apply to plant health. But for the purpose of this presentation, we'll focus on scientific justification. Next. So indeed, the requirement that measures be based on scientific justification is really at the heart of the SPS agreement. It's the cornerstone of the SPS agreement. So, and there are 2 avenues to comply with this obligation to base SPS measures on science. So the first avenue is to base SPS measures on relevant international standards, something that members are strongly encouraged to do in Article 3 of the SPS agreement. So the relevant standards are those developed by the International Plant Protection Convention for Plant Health, the Codex Alimentarius for Food Safety, and the WOHA, founded as OIE, for Animal Health and Zoonosis. So the second avenue is to base SPS measures on a risk assessment, as is foreseen under Article 5.1 of the SPS agreement. Members need to base their phytosanitary measures on an assessment as appropriate to the circumstances of the risks to plant life or health, and take into account risk assessment techniques developed by the IPPC. Next. In certain circumstances, however, WTO members can deviate from relying on international standards or on a risk assessment, and these circumstances are set out in Article 5.7 of the SPS agreement. When relevant scientific evidence is insufficient, members can provisionally adopt SPS measures based on available information without a risk assessment. Members then have to seek additional information and review the SPS measure within a reasonable period of time. So this provision, Article 5.7 of the SPS agreement, embodies the precautionary principle and is critical to dealing with emergency situations. Next. The SPS agreement also defines what a risk assessment is in Annex A. And there are 2 definitions, one for food safety risks and one for pest disease risks. So in the context of pest or disease risks, for plant health then, it is the evaluation of likelihood of entry, establishment, or spread of a pest within the territory of an importing member according to the phytosanitary measures which might be applied and of associated potential biological and economic consequences. Whereas in the context of food safety, a risk assessment is an evaluation of the potential for adverse effects on human or animal health arising from the presence of additives, contaminants, toxins, or disease-causing organisms in food, beverages, or feedstuff. So without going into the details, there are important differences between these two definitions. One speaks about an evaluation of likelihood, the other about an evaluation of the potential for adverse effects. So potential is about evaluating a possibility, while likelihood is about evaluating a probability and is more onerous requirement. So, and only, as mentioned, only the definition for pest or disease risk assessment talks about economic consequences. And the economic factors to be taken into account in the context of pest risk assessments are those that are listed in Article 5.3, paragraph 3 of Article 5, that we will see in a moment. And next. So first, let's have a look at Article 5.2 of the SPS agreement, which gives other indications as to what is to be taken into account in all types of risk assessments. So specifically, members shall take into account scientific evidence together with other factors that are listed on the slide, relevant processes and production methods, relevant inspection, sampling and testing methods, prevalence of specific diseases or pests, existence of pest or disease-free areas, relevant ecological and environmental conditions, and quarantine or other treatment. We can note that this is not a closed list, and other elements can certainly be taken into account in risk assessment activities. And next. So as mentioned earlier, in the context of pest or diseases risk assessments, members need to take into account economic factors that are listed in this Article 5.3, and which are the potential damage in terms of loss of production or sales in the event of entry, establishment or spread of a pest or disease, the cost of control or eradication in the territory of the importing member, and the relative cost effectiveness of alternative approaches to limiting risks. Next. Now, if we refer to risk management, this is not mentioned, the terms risk management in the SPS agreement, but of course it is at the heart of many of its provisions, and the list on this slide is only illustrative, doesn't contain all, to give only a few examples. If we look at the first one, for plant health, Article 2.2 of the SPS agreement calls on members to apply phytosanitary measures only to the extent necessary to protect plant life or health. So we have already discussed our Article 3. If we go further down, we have Article 6, which requires members to ensure that SPS measures are adapted to the phytosanitary characteristics of an area. So members need to take into account, inter alia, the level of prevalence of pests, the existence of eradication or control programs, and appropriate criteria or guidelines, which may be developed by the IPPC. So all these provisions on this slide, as well as others in the SPS agreement, relate to what SPS measures W2 members can decide to adopt. So they all discipline the risk management in this SPS area. There is a decision to be made by the risk assessor. Next. So this is here to look at the work of the SPS committee. Since 1995, the SPS committee has developed guidance to facilitate the implementation of several provisions, which all apply to plant health. And here you have, for example, there is the guidelines related to the implementation of Article 4 of the SPS agreement, which cover equivalence, the implementation of Article 5.5 to achieve consistency in the application of the concept of appropriate level of protection, the implementation of Article 6 on regionalization, the very also important ones on transparency provisions, and to continue the procedure to enhance transparency on special and deficient treatment in favor of developing countries, and the procedure on adult consultations to encourage and facilitate the resolution of specific SPS issues among members in accordance with Article 12.2. Next, So now we wanted to present some transparency-related aspects. And between 2008 and 31st October 2022, about 20% of regular and emergency notifications submitted to the WTO related to plant health. So here we considered the objectives of plant protection or territory protection from other damage from pests, and keywords plant health or plant diseases. And the notification templates used to notify new or revised draft measures or emergency measures allow to identify the relevant standard if it exists. And since 2008, members can also identify if the notified measure conforms to the relevant international standard. So next, we have looked into that, and so of the 20% of notifications related to plant health, about 60% have identified a relevant IPPC standard that the measure, there is a relevant international standard. And in 50, next, for 50% of those 20% have identified a relevant IPPC standard and have indicated that the notified measure conforms to the relevant IPPC standard in question. Next. Now, in terms of specific trade concerns discussed in the SPS committee, about 1/4 relate to plant health. Other STCs may refer to measures related to food safety, animal health, or other types of concerns such as control, inspection, or approval procedures. And of course, one specific trade concern may relate to various topics. Next, please. Here, just to illustrate some examples of references to plant health from STCs discussed at the SPS committee. For example, concerns regarding failure to recognize the pest-free status of a member for some pests. Here, Asian longhorn beetle and citrus longhorn beetle. Concerns on import, suspension of dried chili due to the interception of another pest, the capra beetle. Or another example, concerns about suspension of importation of some products, pineapples, sugar, apples, and wax apples, following detection of scale insects. Making reference to request to resume imports in accordance with SPS agreement and international standards, guidelines, and recommendations, and the reference to the lack of scientific justification. So I think I am a little bit behind already. Next, please. I think we can also, of course, mention that there have been various WTO disputes related to plant health since 1995. So here, you can refer to this dispute. For example, one of the oldest one, Japan's requirement to test each variety of certain agricultural products for efficacy of treatment against codling moth. That was DS-76. I can also mention DS-245 on Japanese measures that restricted apple imports from the US on the basis of concerns about fire blight, which is a disease caused by a bacteria. And more recently, perhaps I can mention the dispute 524, which concerns certain measures imposed by Costa Rica on the importation of the fresh avocados for consumption from Mexico, related to avocado sunblotch viroid. And this dispute ended in May 2022 with the issuance of the panel report. Then perhaps also to mention there is ongoing disputes between Panama and Costa Rica, and perhaps also to mention that there is one dispute that related mainly to food safety, but also had some considerations of biodiversity issues and environment, which is the EC GMOs case. Next, also in the context of the SPS committee, we have organized many thematic sessions and workshops, and for the most part, they are all relevant for plant health. So here you have a listing of some of these activities, more recent and also more older ones. For example, in 2021, we had a dedicated workshop on risk assessment, management, and risk communication. You may remember in June 2021. And we had also a thematic session on fall armyworm in 2019, etc. Pest-free areas, equivalence, regionalization. So the full list is also accessible from our SPS webpage, and you can have also the link on the slide. Finally, next please. Finally, plant health is also, of course, considered in the SPS declaration adopted at the WTO 12 Ministerial Conference, which recognizes the role of the SPS committee in responding to new issues affecting international trade in food, animals, and plants, and instructs the SPS committee to carry out a work program to address issues impacting agricultural trade, such as population growth, climate change, technological innovation, the importance of sustainable agriculture, new pests or diseases, or persisting obstacles to trade. So the committee will report on the outcomes of this work program to the 13th Ministerial Conference, with possibly recommendations as appropriate. And work, just to let you know that yes, work has started in the context of 5 thematic groups on specific topics identified in the SPS declaration work program. And with this, I end my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you, Rolando. Now the floor is open for questions related to the previous presentation. Colombia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just from the Colombian perspective, a clarification about Article 5.7, which have been in the presentation have been stated that it's a reflection of the precautionary principle. At least from the Colombian perspective, that's not accurate enough. The Article 0.7 include a right to provide precautionary measures, not a reflection of the precautionary principle, which is a principle of international environmental law, and is not applicable with regard to Article 5.7 of the SPS agreement. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Is there any further questions or comments? I would ask Randall if you would like to reply.
Not really a reply, but to thank Colombia for this comment. And apologies if I mentioned reflection. I mentioned embodies. That it, in the past it has been considered that the precautionary principle, as you said, can be captured by Article 5.7, but it's not a reflection necessarily. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolando. If there is no further question or comments, let's proceed our thematic session. After having heard from the Secretariat on the relevant provisions of the SPS agreement, let us proceed with Session 2, which focuses on the relevant standards developed by the IPPC, the use of pest risk analysis as a tool to enable trade whilst ensuring plant health protection, and the importance of plant health and trade in supporting food security. May I ask Ms. Sophie Peterson, Mr. Dominique Pelletier, and Ms. Patricia Fracassi to please press the raise hand button. I would ask the speakers to please stay online after their presentations until the end of the QA session. And I have been told that Mr. Pelletier cannot stay for QA session, but he is happy to receive any written questions. First, I would like to invite Ms. Sophie Peterson, IPPC Standard Committee Chairperson and Director of the Pacific Engagement and International Plant Health, Australia's Chief Plant Protection Office of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries, and Mr. Dominique Pelletier, IPPC Implementation and Capacity Development Committee Chairperson and the National Manager of the forestry section of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to jointly present on the development and the implementation of international standards for phytosanitary measures, ISPMs. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Pelletier, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present at this session on the development and implementation of international standards for phytosanitary measures. As just said, I'm Sophie Peterson, the chair of the IPPC Standards Committee, and my co-presenter is chair of the IPPC's Implementation and Capacity Development Committee, Mr. Dominic Pelletier. Next slide, please. So to start, I'll provide a bit of a background introduction to the IPPC. So the International Plant Protection Convention came into force in 1952, and it currently has 184 contracting parties. The aim of the convention is to protect plant resources from the introduction, establishment, and spread of pests, and promote the safe movement and trade of plants, plant products, and regulated articles, so those other things that can carry pests globally. Plant pests have a large impact, with the FAO in 2020 quantifying them as causing between 10 and 16% loss of global harvest and costing us variously at least $220 billion US. So the international standards for phytosanitary measures are the main tool under the convention to support contracting parties achieve their goal. Next slide, please. So as at July 2022, the contracting parties of the IPPC have developed and adopted 46 international standards for phytosanitary measures, 31 diagnostic protocols, 44 phytosanitary treatments, and 10 CPM recommendations. And these recommendations cover important strategic issues that are not appropriate or not yet ready for the development of a standard. Next slide, please. So the Standards Committee manages the standard setting process under the IPPC and is a subsidiary body of the governing body, the Commission on Phytosanitary Measures, or the CPM. The Standards Committee has 25 members taken from the 7 FAO regions represented. And there are between 2 and 4 members taken from each region, as on the slide. And we also have observers from our regional plant protection organisations and, of course, our sister committee, the Implementation and Capacity Development Committee. So the Standards Committee is also supported by 4 standing technical panels. We have a technical panel for phytosanitary treatments, technical panel for diagnostic protocols, the technical panel for the glossary, and the technical panel for commodity standards, which is our newest technical panel. The Standards Committee is also supported by expert working groups that are established for a fixed period to develop or revise international standards. Next slide, please. So the standard setting process is long established and very well articulated, and it's quite specific in regard to how the various documents, be they specifications, ISPMs, diagnostic protocols, or phytosanitary treatments, are submitted, assessed, developed, consulted, refined, and adopted. This is a democratic and transparent process, with all comments received from global consultation being made publicly available. This does mean, though, that it can be a lengthy process to develop standards, but in the main, the delay is felt between the topic being submitted and the expert working group meeting. And once the draft document exists, the process is relatively swift and of a standard length. The process, though, is very important, and ultimately, to achieve adoption and implementation by 184 contracting parties, a clear, consultative, and thorough process is needed, so it shouldn't be seen as a weakness. And the QR code on the slide will send you to a standard setting process video should you be interested in watching it. Next slide, please. So with that overview of the process, I'll now provide some more detail about the review of ISPM 11 Pest Risk Analysis for Quarantine Pests. So in 2014, in 2014, the topic pest risk management was added to the Standards Committee work program. But when it was drafted by the expert working group and reviewed by the Standards Committee, it was determined that it was too difficult to address the issue without duplicating much of the current text within ISPM 11, and duplication across ISPMs is to be avoided as a general rule. So as a result, it was determined that a more holistic review of ISPM 11 was a more appropriate course of action to take to address the need. So the proposal for the review of ISPM 11 was not taken lightly, and it was subject to much discussion within the Standards Committee and the CPM, as this is such a fundamental function supporting safe trade within our rules-based system. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the review or the reorganisation of ISPM 11 is to try to consolidate relevant information from ISPM 2 and 11 into the one document. There are also some components of ISPMs 1 and 24 that may be proposed for consolidation into this revised ISPM 11. And this will lead to a more comprehensive guidance for stages 1 and 2 of the process, so initiation and pest risk assessment, as all of the information will be consolidated and refined without significant changes to the text or the intention. Additionally, to meet the need identified in the request to have the original pest risk management ISPM developed, more information will be developed and included to support pest risk management, so stage 3 of the process. Next slide, please. So to date, the specification or the writing instructions for the expert working group and the specifics regarding the expert working group's establishment was consulted last year and was agreed to be added to the Standards Committee work program. The expert working group is actually meeting this week to develop the draft, and it is quite complex as different expertise is required for each part of the process, and the drafting group also needs to review and consolidate existing adopted materials. So the first opportunity that the Standards Committee will have to review this new ISPM 11 is in May 2023, and July the same year is the first time that it will be eligible for country consultation, assuming that the Standards Committee considers that the draft is developed sufficiently for release. And the QR code on the slide will take you to the relevant specification. And so with that overview of the process and the ISPM 11 reorganisation, I'll hand over to my colleague, Dominique, to discuss implementation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sophie. Very pleased to be here. And so by now, you know more about the standard setting process and more particularly about the ISPM related to risk analysis. And now I would like to take you to the implementation and capacity development, or ICD as we call it, side of things at the IPPC. So the IPPC is the only international standard setting body that has provision that are specific to implementation, in particular Article 11 and 20 of the text. So that sets the tone that guidance should be developed to assist with implementation of the convention and of its standards, which in turn will help with maintaining safe trade. So in other words, and at the risk of oversimplifying it, if all contracting parties have all the same understanding and interpretation of the rules of the game and have the capacity to do so, it will decrease the likelihood of trade issues along the way. So since the creation of the IPPC, the work has been predominantly focused on developing standards. And so today we have over 104 adopted standards. I think that number doesn't quite jive with what Sophie presented earlier, but a lot of standards, which include standards that are conceptual in nature, others that are commodity specific, as well as phytosanitary treatments and diagnostic protocols. Next slide, please. And so it became more apparent in the early 2000s that more effort should be put on implementation and capacity development initiatives. And in 2010, an expert working group on capacity development was established. And the recommendation of that working group at the time was to create a committee dedicated to capacity development. And that recommendation was adopted in 2012 by the CPM, which is the governing body of the IPPC. And so the role of the Capacity Development Committee, that's how they call it at the time, or CDC, was primarily to oversee the implementation of the IPPC Capacity Development Work Plan to meet its capacity building objectives that were stated in the IPPC Strategy Framework 2011 to 2019. But because implementation is more than just that, other IPPC bodies were also involved in ICD activities, and they are listed at the bottom of the slide. And I will not go into details in the interest of time, but simply bear in mind that there were at least 5 different bodies within the IPPC that were involved with ICD at the time. Next slide, please. So there was a clear need to streamline all those activities, and in 2016, a review report of the CDC was shared with the CPM, and it was recommended that a new subsidiary body akin to the Standards Committee be created to underscore the importance of implementation in addition to capacity development within the IPPC community. And so
Recording
that new
in progress.
So that new subsidiary body was named the Implementation and Capacity Development Committee, or IC for short, and it inherited the work of the 5 former IPPC body I just mentioned. And so consequently, the mandate and the work program of the IC is much broader in scope and applies to all activities intended to aid with the implementation by all contracting parties. Next slide. Similarly to the Standards Committee, we have a number of members. So we have 14 members, 7 from the 7 representatives from the 7 FAO regions. We have 5 experts, and 1 representative from the Standards Committee and 1 from the RPPOs. So in total, we have 14. And given the broader scope of the IC, we are approaching our work using 3 different types of groups, depending on the issue. So first, there are the IC subgroups, which are formal in nature with terms of reference and a fixed membership. And they are basically, some of them are taking the function of previous bodies that were involved in implementation. The second type of groups is what we call the IC teams, which are more informal groups in nature. They can be rapidly assembled and dissolved depending on the new emerging issues. And I would like to draw your attention to the one to address the banana fusarium wilt trace 4, which is a rapidly emerging pest. And so we felt that there was an urgent need to assemble any kind of implementation, any kind of resources that will help countries being ready themselves for any potential detection of that pathogen in their countries. And finally, we have working groups that are created as a result of a call for implementation topics to develop ICD resources like guide, courses, and so on. Next slide, please. And speaking of resources, the IC oversees the development of guides and manuals, workshop, tools. For instance, here we have a tool that was recently developed to assist contracting parties with establishing systems approaches. And so that tool helps to identify which appropriate measures are the most pertinent for different production schemes. And the beauty of that tool is that it allows importing and exporting countries to rapidly agree on which measures are the most appropriate. And so the goal really is to help speeding up the bilateral negotiations for market access. So that's a fairly recent tool that was developed. We also produce videos and infographics. And finally, contributed resources. What is meant here is that in some cases, some countries already have developed guides and resources. So rather than reinventing the wheel, we're more than happy to post those contributed resources on the IPPC website and make them available to all. Next slide, please. Yes, partnerships are crucial. Like we mentioned, we are working pretty much hand in hand with the Standards Committee on a lot of different aspects. So we have one Standards Committee representative attending our meetings, and we also have one of ours attending all of the SC meetings as well. We are sharing a framework on standard and implementation, which lists basically the standards and the associated ICD resource. We are participating both to review the topics that are submitted as part of the task force of topics, and we're trying to harmonize our procedures wherever possible. We are also have very strong ties with international organization and donation agencies. So the STDF, the COLE SCP, all of those are involved with development. We are partnering with them. The Regional Plant Protection Organization, I noticed that Juliette Goldsmith from CAFSA is, I think, in attendance today. And obviously academia sometimes have expertise that can be leveraged as well as industry. Next slide, please. In terms of risk analysis related material and activities, we do have a course that was recently developed through a working group, and it's being transformed as an e-learning by the Comité de Liaison Europe-Afrique Caraïbes-Pacifique. So the training manual will be published soon, as well as tutoring sessions. And if you go on the general page on guides and training material, you will find also some resources, primarily in English, but we also welcome any in-kind translation to help translate those resources in all FAO languages. And finally, my next last slide here, please. It's the phytosanitary system page. This came about because many members in the IC firmly believe that the best way to raise awareness about the existence of different ICD resources was to have them posted alongside the standards on the same web page. In other words, the pest risk analysis resources should be posted on the same page as the related standard on PRA. And the same goes for resources to support the inspection of plant products and so on. So we did not obtain exactly that because of various constraints with the IPP, but this is the next best thing. So you have, as part of a phytosanitary system, such as pest-free area, how to set up pest-free areas, you will find on that subpage the standard on pest-free area, as well as resources such as the guides to 8 countries with establishing pest-free area. So I thought I would leave you with that, and there's a QR code where you can access that page rapidly. And with that, I will conclude and turn the floor back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson and Mr. Pelletier. Now I'll give the floor to Ms. Patricia Fracassi, Senior Nutrition and Food Systems Officer of the Food and Nutrition Division of the FAO, to present on plant health and trade in support of food security and nutrition, a food system perspective. Ms. Fracassi, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and I apologize that I cannot turn on my video. I have problem with connection. I'm very glad to be here. And as just mentioned, I will take a food system perspective to discuss plant health and trade in support of both food security and nutrition. Next slide. The SOFI 22 report shows that we are facing a deteriorating food security situation, with 150 million more people facing hunger in 2021 since 2019. Around 2.3 billion people in the world lacked access to adequate food in 2021, and around 3.1 billion people could not afford a healthy diet. 112 million more people since 2019. The world is also not on track to achieve global nutrition targets. Anemia among women and adult obesity are on the rise since the baseline in 2012. Next. Food safety has traditionally been seen as a public health matter, but is increasingly recognized as an important issue for food system. Food safety affects trade, rural income and purchasing power, worker productivity and consumer confidence. 40% of the foodborne disease burden is among children under 5 years of age. High level of aflatoxin in humans are associated with maternal anemia, low birth weight, and child stunting. Aflatoxin contamination has also implication in terms of trade, as we can see from the decline in West Africa shares of the groundnut market from 77% in the 1960s to 4% in 2010. Between 2008 and 2013, fruit and vegetables alone represented about 20% of the EU food export refusals, largely due to the violation of pesticide residue limits. In lower income countries, over 40% of food losses of edible parts of food occur in post-harvest and processing parts of the food system. So therefore, we are arguing that a food system approach is fundamental to understand the drivers of supply and demand of safe and nutritious food that can contribute to food security as well as healthier diets in different contexts. Next slide. A food system approach can help to identify entry points for actions by helping identifying the factors that have the greatest relative impact on facilitating change in a given context. Next. Considering the multiple challenges, we propose to apply a food system perspective from the ecosystem supporting food production to the actual production, processing, distribution, preparation, consumption, and disposal of food. Our proposed theory has biodiversity and healthy diets as key levers to improve food security, nutrition, and health outcomes, and optimize environmental sustainability, and also ensure socioeconomic resilience and growth. Next. Plant health hazards originate in different parts of the food systems. Some plant health hazards originate in the ecosystem. For example, arsenic-contaminated groundwater leads to high level of arsenic in rice. Other hazards develop during production or storage. For example, due to inappropriate pesticide or herbicide use or harmful mycotoxin. Other hazards develop more during retail, during transportation, processing, or retail. For example, through poor sanitary facilities of food handlers or through contaminated water being used, for example, in washing food, such as fruits and vegetables. Next. Food production strongly relies on the quality of soils, being estimated that 95% of our food is directly or indirectly produced on our soil. So plant health hazards are linked to the deteriorating quality of soils due to erosion, contamination, and acidification. So there are important solutions that are of relevance, such as phytoremediation, which can help preventing or reducing soil contamination, but also novel biomass production systems, including crop production, double cropping, flexible crops, intercropping, and agroforestry that have potential to ensure nitrogen content for healthy soils, but also minimize weeds. Next. Also, aflatoxin management has important implications for both food security and nutrition. Climate extremes are increasing the threats of mycotoxin, especially aflatoxin, which are common on maize, groundnuts, and sorghum, but can also go into meat and milk. Mold mitigation strategies, therefore, are essential, and it's important to look at them by looking at tolerant or resistant cultivars with good agriculture practices and biological control. But taking a food system perspective, we also recognize the importance of developing dry chains, which involve drying products to safe levels, followed by moisture-proof strategies, as well as creating improved market incentives for food safety and quality management, and public awareness on the importance of food handling and dietary diversity and demand for food safety. Next. And again, the minimization of food toxin has important implication for food security and nutrition. Nutrient-rich foods, such as fruits and vegetables, are highly perishable and often prone to pest, diseases, and losses. The improper use of pesticide causes a high level of artificial toxin, and this has both a public health but also trade implications. Integrated pest management can minimize economic, health, and environmental risk. And again, if we take a food system perspective, we do recognize the importance of cold and dry chain development, which require investing in better infrastructure and innovation to reduce food perishability, but also creating market incentives to ensure food safety and management. And again, on the demand side, it's important to create public awareness on the importance of food safety, food handling, and dietary diversity. Next. I've been talking about plant health and trade in support of food security and nutrition. And here I would like to share some final consideration. So if we take a food system perspective, this will require working with a diversity of discipline and stakeholders, sometimes with different agendas and priorities, to agree on common strategies. Food safety and reduction of food losses are major concerns in low-income countries for both economic but also nutrition and health reasons. Controlling and mitigating this requires that stakeholders work together to find solutions and manage potential trade-off. This is an example of a good partnership, the Partnership for Aflatoxin Control in Africa, which was established to coordinate aflatoxin mitigation across the health, agriculture, and trade sectors by providing information management system and access to laboratory testing facilities. Another example is the Global Soil Partnership that recently organized a global symposium on soils for nutrition, bringing thousands of participants from a wide range of disciplines and sectors. We encourage similar initiatives to be promoted to ensure innovations at scale. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Fracassi. Now the floor is open for questions related to the two presentations in session 2. Are there any questions or comments? I see none. With this, we conclude session 2 in relation to plant health, trade, and the role of international standards. I would like to thank the speakers for their information, and let us proceed now with session 3, which focuses on best practices in pest risk identification, assessment, and management. May I ask the first 4 speakers from session 3, Dr. Antarjo Dicking, Mr. Harry Arich, Ms. Jing Huang, and Mr. Rosie Liu, to please press the raise hand button and to stay online after your presentation and until the end of the QA session. I would first like to invite Dr. Antarjo Dicking, Senior Expert and Plant Quarantine and Analyst of the Indonesian Agriculture Quarantine Agency of the Ministry of Agriculture, to present on risk analysis practice for plant quarantine in Indonesia. Dr. Dicking, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for my time to present the risk analysis practices for plant quarantine in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Yeah, as we already present at the previous presentation, we always concern with the WTO SPS provision, Article 7, like already mentioned, Article 5, during assessment of risk and determination of appropriate level of protection. And the other side, we also concerned with the IPPC, because dealing with plant health has been endorsed in ISPM. And the other side, we also have national regulation in Indonesia. So, like we have new regulation.
Excuse me, Dr. Dicking. Excuse me.
Yes.
I have been told that your volume is very low. Do you have any other equipment?
Yeah. Yeah, hello, is it okay?
It's still very low, almost the same.
Hello, is it okay?
If you can try to speak closer to the mic, it might be better.
Already maximum. I don't know. Is it okay? Can you hear me?
It's still very low. Could you move your microphone closer to your mouth?
Yeah. Is it okay?
It's a little bit better. So let's continue.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I use all this style. Huh? Okay. Thank you. So let me continue my presentation. Dealing with the ISPM, IPPC, FAO is also as our guideline to conduct the pest risk analysis. And we have the regulation, national regulation, number 21 of 2019, dealing with the quarantine of animal, fish, and plant quarantine. So this is a new regulation, and more concern on the international regulation has been our backbone for the application of risk analysis. And also other government regulation, and some of Minister Agriculture degree has been present in here. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, the implementation of risk analysis is very important to us, particularly like we already have Indonesian National Single Window. It is integrated government agency when they want to release any goods coming from outside. Like we did pest risk analysis, and then we consolidate with the custom for the clearance. So it means we can distinguish whether it is risk goods, mean that the plant or plant product contains with the quarantine pest or not, or maybe this product is not categorized or non-risk goods. So we need that we can also comply or fulfill the requirement of Indonesian National Single Window. And the other side, we also concerned with trade facilities agreement is very clear. No any stock in the port. So we all do only risk management to conduct of that. And then fast track is for particularly non-risk good. And the other side, plant health assurance for the what we call now industry, particularly any product coming from Indonesia for the agro industry. And also we concern with our concern with the government for self-sufficient of rice, no any high risk of pests, particularly pathogen, has been associated with the seed. And to protect the country, particularly dealing with invasive alien species, now many ornamental plants coming to Indonesia, and we don't know the status of plant itself. So even we cannot distinguish what the pest itself, no any information, technical information, particularly the status of pest will be associated with the invasive plant species. And of course, finally, we also support the what is mentioned is commitment in UN Nation, United Nations dealing SDGs. So it is we always doing prior importing commodity before coming to Indonesia when we conduct risk analysis, particularly new species of plant product, or even we distinguish there is new pest and been informed from other countries, should we be concerned on that. Next slide, please. And it is common practice in pest risk analysis, as I mentioned here, initiation, risk assessment, risk management. In here, there is risk communication, meaning any state we should consult with other stakeholders, like initiation, the pest and commodity when coming to Indonesia. Importing countries sometimes always apply when a new commodity coming to Indonesia, when we do, and then we do a risk assessment, and sometimes we always ask the exporting country, particularly through the NPPO, and we should have much information for doing risk assessment. And then in risk assessment itself, we already distinguish whether it is already categorized as quarantine pest, as been mentioned before, as whether it is giving the economic impact and be easy to spread and be established in Indonesia. So we concern on that, and we distinguish follow the standard of IPPC principle, where it is the only quarantine pest has been our concern. Of course, after that, we conduct what is risk management. So in risk management, we should think about what our standards of our level in the profit level of protection, whether it is can do in Indonesia or not. So for the mitigation risk, if not, we should consolidate with the exporting country. Next slide, please. So in application of pest risk analysis, we are divided to pathway and for the pest itself. So in meaning that in pathway, whether it is a plant product or is plant propagation material, and then ornamental plant and biological agent. So biological agent, is it the common happen in Indonesia at the moment? Many importation, profuse or importation like microorganism or by industry or pest control or by fertilizer. And the other side, as I mentioned, is pest, potential pest, is like invasive plant species, particular ornamental plant, is coming to Indonesia in the what you call e-commerce. And the other side is beneficial organism. They seems like a biological agent. So we should also doing risk analysis, whether it is true that will really benefit organism or it is to be pest for us. So this also, we need support from others, particularly from the exporting country, to giving detailed information in this matter. Next slide, please. So in application or conducting risk analysis, is it some difficult situation? So the first is like update technical data global to support risk assessment, risk management, particularly like a pathway of entry. So meaning like for the plant propagation material, sometimes we know that it's pathogen itself. So by the time no more information whether it is seed-borne or seed transmission pathogen, and this is the problem for us. So we cannot make our decision itself without any scientific base behind of that. And the other side, ecology pest is a potential establishment. Mostly we always receive any technical data just based on laboratory tests, no any evidence in the field. So this will be wrong decision if we are not the right to make a confident for decision. And the other side about variety economic losses, also the same happen when they are always based on the laboratory without any field evidence. And risk mitigation, it is many procedure, many guidelines has been published by IPPC is depend on what the pest status itself, what the pest can be conducted, whether the one or two, but mostly we select the efficiency one and effective one. And the other side about pest risk analysis team, it is really time consuming because we need the technical data from the exporting country, and sometimes also we need consultation with other stakeholders. We really understand what the problem dealing with conducting in pest risk analysis should be asked to the expert. Next slide, please. And then the limitation of expert. Now, as we recognize the moment in Indonesia, many people working only in business, less working in plant protection. So this is not easy for us, particularly when we want to have simple and quick detection and identification. Of course, the IPPC already support of us producing the guideline for detection, even the treatment. But there is very limited. But of course, we encourage the IPPC can do more for that to support Indonesia, particularly maybe to other country too. And then deciding as well as possible in mitigation risk from importing commodities. So meaning that we ask the exporting country to do that. So meaning that we easy for us. And the other side is difficult protection based on profit level, particularly if the data, particularly the seed material from multinational company, it is complex situation. The seed producing different country, the same variety, but different country coming. So we cannot make any such what the list should be. I mean, the list of pathogen or the list of pests, particularly to decide for the quarantine pests, and we need more data from number of country has been producing from that multinational company. So this is situation also not easy to conduct. So this take time, and we need consult and should be transparent from the exporting country or transparent to this from the industry, particularly the exporting country which produce of that seed from multinational company. Next slide, I think. Yes, that is my final, and I really appreciate your invitation to me, particularly for Indonesia, has given a chance to inform you how the practices pest risk analysis in us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. De King. I will now give the floor to Mr. Harry Arich, Deputy Head of Plant Health Unit of the European Commission, Directorate General of Health and Food Safety, who will present on the EU requirements and procedures for the management of plant health risks in trade. Mr. Arich, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the floor. And let me start with wishing a good day to everybody attending this thematic session. Yes, I would like to present to you the European Union approach on how to address plant health risk in international trade. Next, please. So just a reminder, the European Union has one for 27 member countries has one single policy for plant health, and of course the objective is to prevent regulated pests to get into the country, to get into the EU, and to establish there or to spread there. And I specifically focus on regulated pests. So we focus on the regulated pests. I explain that more in detail in a second. The accessibility of our market is very precious to us because we are a huge importer of plant material, fruit, vegetables, etc. So the accessibility is important. And of course, the basis of we have completely renewed our approach a couple of years ago, and compliance with WTO SPS and IPPC, the convention and the standards was of course the starting point. Next, please. So, as I said, we protect ourselves against the regulated pests. So which are the regulated pests? We have about 400 quarantine pests and about 200 regulated non-quarantine pests listed. The quarantine pests are all for all of them, we have a recent risk assessment done horizontally, which would be the risk for that pest for the EU territory. And in addition to that, member states are supposed to have a system in place, a surveillance program, a multi-annual surveillance program to verify that their territory is still free from it, or for a couple of those quarantine pests, they are locally present, and then there have to be quarantine measures in place, of course. Because we want to avoid, as it is foreseen in Article 6 of the IPPC Convention, that first of all, when we take measures that the measures are against regulated pests, and secondly, that we apply not more restrictive requirements for import from trading partners compared to eventually infested areas within our own territory. The regulated non-quarantine pests are the pests that we took over, which were called in the past quality pests that are related to plant propagating material. So for most of them, the tolerance is also zero at import, but for some of them, we might handle a certain tolerance for introduction, because these are pests which are not absent from the EU territory, but at least we want to keep propagating material circulating or introduced in the EU to be free from it. Next, please. So the risk management for those regulated pests, first of all, of course, there is a prohibition of introduction of those pests into the EU, be it in an isolated form or be it attached to plant material. They should not come into the EU. And for a number of them, we have specific import requirements. And when I say specific import requirements, then they are specific, related to a specific pest. So that makes it maybe a little bit difficult to read our legislation, because you have to look at different pests. But on the other hand, we have all our requirements, so regulated pests, but also import requirements are published or freely consultable, and that means also that you can quite quickly check which are the import requirements, how you can fulfill them, and how you can start trading to the EU. Next, please. Well, that was for the regulated pests. So do we not care at all about non-regulated pests and maybe about new risks or new threats? Yes, we do. That's why we have a system of horizon scanning in place, meaning that we have continuously through EFSA, our European Food Safety Authority, and the European and Mediterranean Plant Protection Organization, drawing up reports every month about emerging threats, be it in non-EU countries as well as within EU countries, and which we look at during our monthly meetings with phytosanitary experts from all member states, and where we then check and decide if further risk assessment is needed, and eventually a regulation needs to be considered. But so for the non-regulated pests, we in principle do not have restrictions in place. We first will analyze them and eventually regulate them, and then we have restrictions in place. Next, please. So the phytosanitary accessibility of the EU market, important there is to state that we have an open system. As I said, we have our import requirements are published or accessible to everybody. So in a way that everybody can quickly find out if we have specific import requirements. related to specific quarantine pests that we have, related specifically to the relevant commodity, and how you can fulfill them. Usually there is more than one option. It might be, the country might be pest-free or pest-free area. It might be that there is a treatment that can be carried out, or that there is a systems approach possible. Um, depending on the possibility, the option that can be fulfilled, trade can take place. Of course, the commodity needs to be accompanied by a phytosanitary certificate, quite often with some additional um, requirements that need to be established as a declaration on the PC. Important to state and to indicate here is also that we will official statements from the National Plant Protection Organization, we accept them. Unless we have a reason for not accepting, because we have some indications that, for example, a country is not pest-free, although it's indicated that the country is pest-free. But normally, when an MPPO states that, for example, we are a pest-free country based on ISPM 4, so the international standard, then we do accept it. That means that in principle, in general, there is no need for bilateral agreements between the exporting country and the EU as the importing entity, and trade can immediately start. Access to one of the member states means also access to all 27 member states, in the meaning that there is immediately a consumer market of 500 million people available. Next one. No rules without exceptions. So we have a couple of exceptions. For example, some key commodities like seed potatoes or propagating material for citrus. There we have a closed system. Our market is not open. And for 37 high-risk plants that we identified 3 years ago, we operate also a closed system, meaning that we will first carry out a commodity risk assessment to check for what would be the risk of unregulated pests, because for the regulated one, we have already our established requirements, but to check if from a certain origin, there is no additional risk from so far for the EU unregulated pests. We will check those, and we will then issue a special import authorization in the form of a legislation or a regulation. So we operate this system only since less than 3 years now. We have received about 55 requests for such a special import authorization, and in about 2.5 years, we issued so far 25 special import authorizations. So the system is quite smoothly working and taking up an acceptable time frame, let's say. And of course, in case of emergency, we have the possibility to take emergency measures, in which case we just do a WTO notification or for information and not for consultation, because we want that the measures, of course, enter into action quite quickly, and in principle, those measures are then also they have a temporary status. Next one. The import control is harmonized in all 27 member states. That means that we have identical legislation and identical working procedures in place in all border inspection posts all over the EU. That also means that all data from all consignments that are imported wherever into the EU, that those data are centralized in one database, where also all the results of those inspections are brought together. And that allows us also to better organize risk-based import inspections in a way that we can adapt this on an annual, at least on an annual basis. We review our import control frequencies in a way that we can adjust it at least once per year, and if needed, more. Next one. In case of recurring import problems, we have a team of commission auditors in place who can go and check in the country of export and analyze what the problem might be, how it can be improved. They issue also recommendations in a report that is also published, so it's publicly available for everybody. And we are expecting that those recommendations are then addressed in some way, that the guarantees can be increased with to continue the trade. If not, we might need to strengthen the import requirements for that particular problem coming from a specific origin. Next one. And finally, we do not just analyze the situation in third countries, but we have also programs in place to train, to help third countries to address problems. We have a program of better training for safer food. That's a training program that we use also within the EU, but also in non-EU countries to help to explain our legislation and to address in a more horizontal way what should be the expectations for the products when they are exported to the EU. And for in case of particular problems, we can also activate technical assistance programs in third countries to solve special problems. That's a little bit the overview. Next one, I think that was the last one. So thank you very much for your attention, and always available if there would be some questions afterwards.
Thank you, Mr. Arich. I now invite Ms. Jing Huang, Senior Agronomist at the Research Center of GACC for International Inspection and Quarantine Standards and Technical Regulations of China, and Mr. Rosie Liu, Senior Agronomist at the Science and Technology Research Center of China Customs, to jointly present on research and practice of risk assessment method in China. Ms. Huang and Mr. Liu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today, my colleague Ms. Liu and I would like to talk to you about research and practice of pest risk assessment methods in China. Please, next slide. The presentation is divided into 4 parts, and I will introduce the first 2 parts. Firstly, I will briefly overview the research and development of pest risk method in China. As we all know, the process of globalization has made the problem of exotic species invasion increasingly serious, and plant quality work is facing more challenges. To improve the science of quarantine decisions, regional plant protection organizations have given high priority to PRA. Please, next. PRA in China started early in the 1980s and can be roughly divided into 4 stages. In the first stage, phytosanitary researchers focused on the introduction risk of pests by human activities. Evaluation scoring criteria criteria were established based on the distribution, spread, and spreading potential of the pest, the ease of control, and the economic importance of affected crops. The research results of this phase provided a scientific basis for the development and revision of the earning list of quarantine pests. In the second stage, phytosanitary researchers focus on the potential geographic distribution of pests. CRIMAX, GIS, and other software were used to study the potential geographic distribution of significant pests, such as Johnson grass, TCK, cordon moss, fireblight, etc. These studies predicted that importing some agricultural products could lead to potential dangers. In the third stage, phytosanitary researchers focused on systemic assessment methods. The related facts affecting the risk of pest were systemically analyzed and studied. The framework of evaluation index system, criteria, and quantitative analysis methods were developed. In the fourth stage, phytosanitary researchers focus on computer-aided software tools based on large amount of basic person information. Risk assessment models for human-computer collaboration have been developed and are widely used in China. Next slide, please. In the following, I will describe the human-computer method. The method emphasizes human-centered and computer-assisted risk assessment procedures, including the pest categorization and assessment criteria, were developed based on ISPM, especially for the number 2 and the number 11. The regional pest quarantine information database can provide critical scientific information support for expert decision making in the assessment process. Next, please. This is the workflow diagram of the method. It can be divided into 3 parts. Part 1, automatic generation of a list of pests. Identify the pests that are associated with the pathway, for example, by products, name, berry, and the country of origin, chili. Automatic generation of a list of pests that may be acquired on the chili cherries. Part 2, pest categorization. The categorization process examines for each pest whether the criteria in the definition for quarantine pests are satisfied. Part 3, pest risk assessment. A number of assessment methods currently used for pest risk assessment are centralized in this system for experts to choose from. Next, please. These are 2 screenshots of the method. Left is pest categorization, including 3 steps of screening. Step 1, presence or absence in the PRAR and the migration status of the pest. Step 2, harmful parts by pests. Step 3, potential for establishment and spread and economic consequences. All the elements should be considered in the pest categorization. Right is the expert assessment method. which provides a system of assessment indicators and judgment criteria, as well as its unique mathematical model. Past related information and judgments are automatically obtained in the assessment process, and the expert analyze and adjust the results of each step of the judgment, then draws conclusions. These are the main functions of the method. That's all I have to present. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Liu. I'm going to talk about the practice of pest risk assessment methods in China. Please, next. As we all know, PRA is an important element of phytosanitary work, and is the scientific basic for developing phytosanitary measures. The Chinese government attaches great importance to PRA. Human-computer collaboration risk assessment methods have been used for many years in the customers, Department of Agriculture and Forestry research institutions, and have become one of the essential tools for PRA in China. First, data reliability. All data can be tracked back to its source. The information comes from authoritatively professional databases, official websites of quarantine institutions, publicly published books, journal literatures, and so on. The information basically covers the main information required to carry out PRA. Second, process intelligence tool. Information and judgment related to pest are automatically obtained during the assessment process. Factors adjust the result according to the situation. Relying on the high integration of data, information, and the intelligent risk assessment model, this method completely gets rid of the situation that the risk assessment of pest is subject to the ability of and the experience of experts in the past. It greatly improves the scientific nature and the timeliness of risk assessment and produce very significant social benefit. Next. Up until now, over 1,800 PRA tasks have been carried out by this method in China, mainly used in the following situations. For example, market access for agriculture products, develop and revise the list of regulated pests, develop emergency phytosanitary measures, and retrospectively review of the phytosanitary policies. Next. Finally, I would like to talk to you about the outlook of PRA research in China. Also, the work of pest biological risk analysis has made some advancements in China, but still need to continue to work in the following areas. First, continue to strengthen the construction of basic information database. The content of pest biological risk analysis is developing and changing, and the assessment dimension is broader. So need to expanding the scope of information collection and expanding the content of information. Pay attention to data quality to ensure the authority and the traceability of information. Second, conducting research, not finished. Second, conducting research on rapid PRA methods. The risk of a cross-border spread of pests has intensified, and the situation of prevention and control it poses has become increasingly serious. Under the limited information conditions, quickly put forward a scientific risk assessment conclusion is needed, and also optimize the risk assessment process and the evaluation indicators. Last, further enhance the level of intelligence of PRA methods. Computerized deep learning research using big data technology, such as intensive collection of PRA conclusions, using machine learning methods to provide assessment conclusion is needed. That's all we reported. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Huang and Mr. Liu. The floor is now open for questions related to the three presentations from Dr. Diking, Mr. Arij, Ms. Huang, and Mr. Liu. Are there any questions or comments? I see Senegal, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, de nous avoir donné la parole. Nous avons suivi avec beaucoup d'intérêt les différentes communications qui ont été faites, particulièrement celle de l'Union européenne par rapport à l'approche s'agissant de la gestion, en tout cas des risques phytosanitaires. C'est vrai que cette année, c'est vrai en Afrique de l'Ouest, on a eu une campagne très difficile, en tout cas pour certaines filières. Bon, je ne sais pas, parce qu'en réalité, beaucoup d'efforts ont été faits. Mais moi, je voudrais poser aux représentants de l'Union européenne, est-ce qu'il est envisagé quelque chose en matière de traitement de quarantaine au point d'entrée? Parce qu'il ne s'agit pas également juste de mettre la pression sur le pays qui exporte pour effectivement faire de la surveillance, du contrôle des traitements de quarantaine. Mais dans d'autres pays, par exemple, à l'entrée des produits, au premier point d'entrée, il y a des traitements de quarantaine qui se font. Pourquoi l'Union européenne ne peut pas procéder comme cela pour rendre les choses un peu plus claires? Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Senegal. Is there any more question or comments? The United States, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks to the presenters. Those were really interesting presentations, and I appreciate everyone for sharing their experience and perspectives. I had a question for the regarding the presentation from the European Union. I was really interested to hear about sort of the categorization of specific products that were, I guess, sort of closed for import, and I guess I wasn't aware of that, and I was wondering if that closure, or whether there's like, if that's based on some sort of legislation that's product by product, or whether there's a list of what products are not available to be exported or that won't be accepted for export into the European Union, and maybe how many products that might be. Thanks.
Thank you, the United States. I see the hand from Chinese Taipei online. Chinese Taipei, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and also thank four speakers for the informative presentations. My question goes to Mr. Harry Adres, and similar to the question from the United States. In the EU's presentation, there are three exceptions in your regulation. The first one is imported clothes for a few key commodities, including seed potatoes and the citrus plants for planting. So, Mr. Aris, could you clarify the EU's regulation on this point? Does that mean under any circumstances, the exporting country cannot export seed potatoes to the European Union, even though they can provide some scientific evidence or apply in for market access? Thank you.
Thank you, Chinese Taipei. Is there any other questions or comments? Maybe I can also add one question to the EU. Because you mentioned the one common market with free movement, and so that means your quarantine regulations are applied to 27 member states. So do you have any program to monitor the consistency of the implementation of your quarantine regulations? I know that you have a database to see the result, but do you have any inspectors to your member state to see whether it has been implemented well? Thank you. So we have 4 questions to the EU. I would like to invite Mr. Arij to reply. Thank you.
Thank you very much, thank you very much, everybody, for those questions. The first was from Senegal on asking for the possibilities that quarantine treatments should be carried out at the point of entry instead of at the port of export. Well, indeed, in principle, there can be in some particular cases, there can be an exception, but the general rule is that consignments of plant products exported to the EU should arrive already safe and fulfill the guarantees as it is foreseen on the phytosanitary certificate, because the phytosanitary certificate has to guarantee that the products are fulfilling the import requirements of the country of destination. And our basic import requirements of the EU is that only products that are plant material that are free from our quarantine pest are accessible on our market, can be imported into the EU. So therefore, as a general rule, we do not accept treatments at the point of entry. Having said that, it can, when at the point of entry a consignment is found to be non-compliant, and so because of the presence of a regulated pest, and then there are different possibilities that can be applied by the import inspectors. Either send it away again outside the EU, or it can be destroyed, or a third one that is available, that is carry out a treatment in a way to make it compliant with the EU import legislation. That is an option that can be applied, and that is applied regularly, but as an exception to the rule. We do not want that that there would be a systematic trade of commodities that do not fulfill the EU legislation, and that need to be treated at destination or at the point of entry. We do not think that is compliant with requirements and with guarantees that are to be foreseen on a phytosanitary certificate. The 3 other countries, or at least 2 other questions, so from United States and from Chinese Taipei, relate to where 99.9% of our market is open. There is indeed 0.1% or where we apply a more closed approach. And indeed, we have a list. It's laid down in legislation in a big implementing act where you have all the list of quarantine pests, where you have all the import requirements, but where you also have the import prohibitions. And we have a list of it's between 20 and 30 commodities that in principle you cannot they are not allowed for import in the EU. What does not mean that you cannot get a derogation from it. But the derogation that will include a very specific and detailed investigation, risk analysis, of course, and we do give uh, so derogations for it. But as our principal point is that, and I mentioned there the seed potatoes, I mentioned there the propagating material of citrus, because these are commodities that are very important for the EU itself, for our own agricultural industry production, and so where we in principle say, okay, we want to be very careful for that. We want to have the highest level of guarantee, and that is, of course, if you have no introduction at all from outside the territory. However, as I said, is it impossible to get a derogation? No, it is not. But that the procedure to get it then will be more difficult than what I told for those 37 high-risk plants. There we have a standardized procedure that is applied, as I said, in 3 years' time, we had about 55 requests for derogation for those few prohibitions that we have. There it's rather exceptional that we get a request for a derogation and that we grant a derogation. That is not happening even on an annual basis, one single time, I must say. So is it based on law? Yes, it is based on law. Is it impossible to deviate from that? No, it is not impossible, but we have a very strict. It's a bit as a can I call it a compensation? For the rest, we have an open market. You decide on your own if you want to start export from a phytosanitary point of view, of course. If a country wants to start exporting to the EU, except for a very limited number of products where a thorough, so a detailed investigation is needed. So for this limited number of products, we call it permanent prohibition in principle. And for the 37 high-risk plants, it's a provisional. We only will look at if there are some for the EU, so for unregulated pests for which we want to look into and to maybe add some additional import restrictions. But for the more permanently prohibited ones, we will do a complete, full, detailed commodity risk assessment, which of course takes some time. I think let me focus that there are many trading partners that operate such a system in a much larger basis than we do on the few commodities that we have prohibited in the EU. The last question from WTO related to our common market. Are we, at least how I understood the question, are we consistent for ourselves? Are we not imposing requirements on trading partners which we do not apply on ourselves? First of all our regulated pests, our quarantine pests, as I said in my presentation, there is the obligation for the member states to check if that pest is really still absent from the EU, and if it will not be absent from the EU if quarantine measures are in place to keep it under control. And whenever we issue import requirements for third countries, when we have specific import requirements, we always compare that when we have that pest present in the EU, that we have a similar approach for those areas which are under quarantine, that have to apply the same requirements when they want to to trade the same product then from the infested area within the EU to non-infested areas within the EU. That's always a very important concern, and that's you can always find that whenever we do the SPS notification of new import requirements. Is one of our main criteria to be checked. Yes, so I do think that on that point we are certainly not kind of operating a different approach for movements within the EU compared to from other trading partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arich. I now invite the remaining 3 speakers from session 3, Ms. Helen Anderson, Ms. Lilian Daisy Libanez Olat, and Dr. David Dale, to please press the raise hand button and to stay online after your presentation and until the end of the QA session. I will first give the floor to Ms. Helen Anderson, Pest Risk and Analyst of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the United Kingdom, who will present on identification of pests of phytosanitary concern. Ms. Anderson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And just can I check, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to speak about the identification of pests of phytosanitary concern and how we approach this issue and bring it into processes that are used within the UK. If I could go on to the next slide, please. So I am a pest risk analyst, and as already mentioned, I work for the National Plant Protection Organisation, DEFRA, the Department of Environmental and Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. Next slide, please. Plant pests, as we all know, have huge impacts globally, causing a range of different impacts, economic, environmental and social, whether that be food shortages and hardship, as well as affecting the wider environment and also well-being. We have a consensus that limiting the losses caused by pests and diseases is important. But one of the key things is trying to identify which pests are of phytosanitary concerns. So an emerging plant health threat is defined in a number of different ways, one of which is as a pest which has an unexpected increase in possibility of introduction. That might be because its incidence is increasing, populations are increasing, or it has changed its geographical range. There may also be a change in the host range of a particular known plant pests, or there may be a new sort of newly identified plant pest. This might be something which has not previously been considered a plant pest, or might be something that is completely new to science. Next slide, please. So horizon scanning is the phrase we use to describe processes we use to try and identify the emerging phytosanitary threats. And we've got a range of different methods that we employ and are utilized. Some are more manual and some are more automated than others in order to look at and keep abreast of changes in information and on different pests that can come from a range of different sources. It's not the only way we gather data, of course. We gather a lot of knowledge from MPPO border inspections and also from inland surveillance. But learning about changes which are occurring elsewhere in the world and which might give us information on threats we have yet to face is crucial to being able to prepare. In the UK, our horizon scanning is normally done by pest risk assessors, but whoever in the sort of whatever plant health scientists are doing the horizon scanning, there are a number of different ways which they can do it. Next slide, please. Oh, and apologies. Next slide, please. So the traditional horizon scanning is very participatory, with the risk assessor or whoever is conducting the horizon scanning making a physical effort to actually look through journals and articles in the press. These days, it's much more likely to be done online rather than physically going through publications, although that certainly still happens. But it is still ongoing and physically looking through for keywords and articles of interest, and involves also making sure that you have access to the right kind of publications, whether that be of a new journal, publications, or tweets from research institutes. Next slide, please. What we would term sort of more non-participatory horizon scanning is where some of the initial searching's already been done for us. So that might be through automated systems which are used to scan the internet or journals for open source intelligence. So that might be sort of Google Alerts or Web Science Alerts or whatever other system is being used. The user can set up these for certain keywords, but also specific searches for areas of particular interest. For example, there might be particular pests which are known to be spreading and which you wish to have an early alert as possible on new developments. There are also a number of well-known systems which compile knowledge for plant health scientists, and I have not provided on here a definitive list of these, it's just some examples. But some of them, such as CABI, Plant Life, they gather information in one place, making it easier for plant health scientists to scan for publications of interest. Others, such as the EPO reporting service, so that is the European Plant Protection Organization, they provide a reporting service, or the USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture, Pest Lens, provide context, and this helps plant health scientists to be able to see what changes actually might be by providing some information on why they've been picked up, the distribution, host plants, biology, and damage, and the sort of pathways they might be, pests might be associated with. All of these methods and sources provide us with information that raises awareness of pest spreading and of changing in some ways, and helps us gather information on pests of concern. But there are many, many diverse sources, and there can be time logs with some of them, and there's also some information which may come sort of in real time. And there are several different systems to collect and share information, and a variety of interpretation and degree of context. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, there's huge amounts of information about plant pests out there, and depending on national plant protection organizations, they could have themselves several hundred pests actually listed, any of which could become emerging pests through changes in geography or host range, and with more recommended regulation as well by organizations such as our regional plant protection organizations, and by new pests coming up in horizon scanning all the time. National plant protection organizations are going to have a variety of resources to handle these. There can be a handful to over 100 staff involved in capturing and evaluating and assessing information on emerging pests. And some of the key challenges faced by the limited resources are, of course, sort of lack of staff and the amount of diversity of information, and filtering all the relevant information and adapting it for the local context. So what we need to have as a NPPO is a way to focus on the most important pests. And the way the UK approached this was to find a way to prioritise the pests, but do so in a way that allowed us to consult with other pest experts for advice. This pest experts within the UK. So that's what this led the UK to develop a protocol for ranking pests and prioritising pests, which we call the Plant Health Risk Register. Next slide, please. So the development of the risk register was actually initiated following the spread of ash dieback to the UK. when an expert task force made a series of recommendations about plant health biosecurity for the UK. And one of them was to create a plant health risk register as a way of prioritising actions on pests. So the risk register uses a range of simple rules just to rate the likelihood of a scenario and the impacts of a scenario happening. And the two main scenarios we use are pest is introduced and pest spreads to maximum extent, for obvious reasons that some pests may have already sort of entered the UK, but maybe in a limited area, and we wish to try and contain this. So the risk register follows the same sort of information that's used in the pest risk assessment, looking at entry, establishment, spread, and impact, but also takes into account value at risk, and uses fairly simple rules, much more simple rules than the much detailed analysis that goes into a PRA. The risk ratings are given as unmitigated risk, that's risk without coordinated actions in place, and mitigated risk, taking into account existing mitigations such as regulation, which allows the effects of actions on the level of risk to be seen and helps us to prioritise what other actions there might be that may help, such as surveillance, PRA, contingency plans, and regulations. We now have over 1,400 plant pests on the risk register, but that doesn't mean there are actually 1,400 pests we would take action on. What it is it's a tool to enable us to make comparisons between different pests. And when we have looked at some, we have decided that they're not a priority for the UK, mainly due to inability to be able to establish due to climate or a lack of available hosts in the UK. The actions are all recorded at the end of the prioritisation and indicate what we would need to do in the event of a finding in the UK. Next slide, please. So on my final slide, what I wanted to just show was the process we use in the UK, capturing the information using all the different types of sources I mentioned earlier, evaluation of the information through risk register prioritization tool, and then assessment of individual pests, which are considered a priority through the formal pest risk analysis process using international standards. It should also be noted that this is what the process could be all the way through to formal assessment, as in some cases the process stops at evaluation, and the horizon scanning and screening of the data captured is carried out in the UK by risk assessors, with data collected being stored on filing systems so that accumulated changes can be tracked, even if an individual change doesn't result in a pest being evaluated or re-evaluated. The evaluation process itself has input from risk assessors, risk managers, plant health inspectors, and policy, with decisions on priorities being agreed on in monthly meetings before they're formally published online. And in case anyone is interested in having a look at pests we have or are in the process of assessing, please feel free to have a look at the link which I've provided at the bottom of the slides. Next slide, please. And that was the end of my presentation, actually. And so I will leave for now in case there's any questions for later.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. I now invite Ms. Lillian Daisy Libanez Olat, Head of the Pest Risk Analysis Section, Plant Quarantine Subdepartment of the Agricultural, Forestry, and Seed Protection Division of Chile's Agricultural and Livestock Service, to present on the identification of best practices in pest risk assessment and management in Chile. Ms. Ibanez Olat, you have the floor.
Hola, buenos días a todos y a todas. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Yes, we can hear you.
Ok. La siguiente, por favor. A modo de introducción, les voy a contar y les agradezco la oportunidad de poder contarles nuestra experiencia, ya que somos una unidad de análisis de riesgo que se formó ya hace varios años atrás, a partir del 2005, y en todos estos años hemos podido identificar algunas mejoras y algunas prácticas que han llevado a que nuestro trabajo se pueda realizar de manera más simple y de manera más eficaz. También somos 5 analistas de riesgo con especialidad en entomología, fitopatología y malherbología. Y actualmente los evaluadores de riesgo se encuentran separados de lo que son los reguladores de riesgo. Es decir, hay analistas, especialistas profesionales que se dedican a la evaluación de riesgo y luego otras profesionales toman esta evaluación, este documento como insumo para poder definir las normas que regularán los productos que se desean importar. La siguiente, por favor. Esta presentación está focalizada de manera de ir mencionando a ustedes algunas buenas prácticas que hemos ido identificando en el transcurso de estos años. Y quizás parezcan cosas demasiado obvias, pero sí creo que es importante que las resaltemos en este minuto porque son factores que pueden ser fácilmente implementados por aquellas unidades que quizás no tienen tanto tiempo de trabajo y que puedan ir mejorando su proceso de evaluación de riesgo. Un factor relevante e importantísimo en la evaluación de riesgo es el fortalecimiento de los recursos humanos. Como ustedes saben, los análisis de riesgo los realizan profesionales generalmente del área biológica y que deben tener experiencia y exclusiva dedicación en la evaluación de riesgo. Esto no significa que no sepan de otros, no tengan otros conocimientos ni de otras áreas en la ONPF en la que se desarrollan, pero sí dedicarse a la evaluación de riesgo, porque el análisis de riesgo debe ir acompañado de experiencia. Es una práctica que debido a que al desarrollarla y al repetirla, genera que la metodología se vaya afinando y perfeccionando. El análisis de riesgo debe acompañarse de experiencia, ya que su aplicación repetida desarrolla las capacidades de las personas y perfecciona la metodología. Por eso es muy importante que se cuiden a las personas que tienen esta experiencia, porque a medida que esta metodología se va repitiendo en el tiempo, se va haciendo un proceso con mayor eficacia. La siguiente, por favor. Ya se ha mencionado antes el reconocimiento y la importancia de la información, el acceso que tenemos a la información. Y esto está mencionado en la NINF 11. La recopilación de la información es un elemento básico de todas las etapas del análisis de riesgo. Por eso es importantísimo que los analistas de riesgo podamos contar con esta información. Sin información, la evaluación de riesgo se hace más compleja, los niveles de incerteza se elevan y el riesgo puede estar sobrevaluado o subestimado. La entrega de información de parte de las ONPF exportadoras es fundamental para la realización del estudio y debe ser de calidad completa y proporcionada oportunamente. El acceso a la información científica de alta calidad, eso también la expositora anterior mencionó ciertas bases de datos que utilizamos todos los analistas, ya sea como el CAGI, la EPO, la página de USDA. Todos estos generan información que es muy importante para el desarrollo de la evaluación de riesgo. Y a veces son páginas o accesos de libre acceso que no son pagados y que se puede contar con ellos. Pero una información fundamental para poder realizar la evaluación de riesgo es también la que proporciona la ONPF exportadora. Si esa información es buena, es mucho más simple y mucho más eficaz poder realizar la evaluación de riesgo. Y nosotros en el transcurso de estos años hemos ido implementando una metodología en que solamente ingresan a nuestro calendario de evaluación de riesgo aquellos ONPFs exportadoras que entregan información completa y buena para poder hacer la evaluación. La siguiente, por favor. Un aspecto importante que parece cierto obvio es la planificación. En el transcurso de estos años, yo me inicié cuando se inició la unidad de análisis de riesgo en el Servicio Agrícola y Ganadero de Chile, y tendíamos a ingresar en nuestro calendario a hacer todos los análisis de riesgo que se nos solicitaban. En el transcurso de este tiempo nos hemos ido dando cuenta que la planificación es importante. Es importante porque trae consigo beneficios. Permite a los analistas de riesgo ordenar su trabajo, conocer los tiempos de respuesta, lograr mayor eficiencia en el cumplimiento de los compromisos bilaterales y además mejorar la transparencia y la confianza en las decisiones regulatorias. Si se sabe cómo yo estoy planificando mi trabajo, cuándo voy a tener la oportunidad de responder, para cuándo lo planifiqué, es mucho más transparente y confiable. La siguiente. También es importante la utilización de guías de ARP y estandarización de criterios. Si bien nos guiamos por la NINF número 11, que da los lineamientos para la elaboración y evaluación de riesgo, tenemos nuestra propia guía, que es una guía que ha sido elaborada por los grupos técnicos de la Organización Regional de Protección Fitosanitaria, de la cual Chile es parte, que es COSAVE, el Comité de Sanidad Vegetal del Cono Sur, y en ella se ha desarrollado esta guía que se basa en los lineamientos de la NINF 11, pero además permite que se homogeneicen los criterios, mejora la objetividad y transparenta los criterios. Esto es importante porque las evaluaciones de riesgo a veces efectuadas con los mismos datos, pero por distintas personas o instituciones difieren en la conclusión. Entonces, al tener una guía, es mucho más fácil poder ser más objetivo en la evaluación. La siguiente. Es importante, como mencionó la expositora anterior, la identificación de las plagas. O sea, esa es la base para poder realizar la evaluación de riesgo. Y hemos ido mejorando los tiempos de respuesta en lo que se refiere a los análisis de riesgo para plagas, debido al riesgo que están asociadas porque son plagas que podrían estar asociadas a productos que ya están entrando y que no han sido reguladas. Entonces, como similar, ¿cierto?, a lo que mencionaba la expositora de Reino Unido anteriormente, ella decía, este escáner que se puede hacer para poder identificar las plagas a las cuales yo les tengo que dar prioridad y para las cuales yo tengo que establecer medidas. Y una información muy relevante y que como buena práctica, nosotros a través de estos años hemos ido sistematizando la información, son los récords de intercepción, es decir, las plagas que se interceptan en los productos que se están importando y que están entrando al país. Eso nos da a nosotros información base para poder definir las plagas que están generando presión. También una práctica que hemos ido realizando es la revisión de las notificaciones sobre medidas sanitarias y fitosanitarias de los países miembros de la OMC. Eso nos da a nosotros información relevante sobre qué están haciendo, qué plagas están regulando otros países y nos genera una alerta para ver si nosotros también deberíamos regular tales o cuales plagas después de una correspondiente evaluación de riesgo por plaga. Tenemos una constante revisión bibliográfica para detectar las plagas que están ausentes en Chile y que tienen potencial de ser cuarentenarias para nuestro país. Además, detectamos para cuando se realizan los análisis de riesgo para estas plagas que se han detectado por estas alertas mundial, elaboramos la evaluación considerando todas las vías probables a través de las cuales puede ingresar la plaga. Si bien a veces se detectan plagas que pueden estar asociadas solo a una vía, cuando uno realiza la evaluación de riesgo por plaga se da cuenta que pueden haber otras vías. Y es importante regular todas las vías a través de las cuales esta plaga podría ingresar. Y un aspecto relevante es la actualización de nuestras listas de plagas cuarentenarias, ya que si hay alguna plaga que le hemos realizado evaluación de riesgo y que la hemos incorporado en nuestra lista, esta ya puede tener medidas y facilita mucho más la evaluación. La siguiente, por favor. También hemos logrado algunas mejoras en la evaluación de algunos productos. Por ejemplo, el desarrollo de análisis de riesgo para semillas de distintas especies procedentes de todo origen. Eso, si bien al inicio significa mucho más trabajo porque significa evaluar todas las plagas a nivel mundial que podrían estar asociadas a este producto, va facilitando la actividad regulatoria a medida que pasa el tiempo. También la actualización de análisis de riesgo para productos para los cuales existe comercio y tienen una regulación antigua. Otra medida, otra buena práctica que nos hemos ido dando cuenta es que tenemos que fijarnos en aquellos productos que están ingresando al país y que pueden significar algún riesgo. La siguiente, por favor. Y por último, las cuestiones que debemos tener en consideración. Toda la información a incluir en la etapa de evaluación de riesgo deberá estar asociada a las referencias bibliográficas correspondientes, a efectos de poder consultar la justificación científica. Es importante que todo quede citado, documentado y respaldado durante la evaluación de riesgo. De esta manera, cualquier duda o cualquier consulta que se presente por parte del país exportador, se tiene la referencia bibliográfica, la cual respalda la información y cómo se llegó a esa evaluación. Aspectos comunes de todas las etapas de la RP son, por ejemplo, la identificación de la incertidumbre. Se debe identificar especialmente en las medidas que incrementan el nivel de riesgo. Es súper importante transparentar durante la evaluación de riesgo qué genera incertidumbre y cuáles son los factores y por qué yo pude determinar que me subió el riesgo debido a fuentes de incertidumbre que se generen durante la evaluación. La documentación, a fin de que las fuentes de información y el fundamento de las decisiones relativas al manejo puedan demostrarse con claridad. Es importante que queden documentados, que quede respaldo de cómo se hizo la evaluación, de manera de que si cualquier persona necesita, por transparencia, requiere el documento, se sabe cómo se tomaron las decisiones. Y la comunicación, que es un factor muy relevante, muy importante, las medidas fitosanitarias obtenidas como resultado del análisis de riesgo de plaga deberán analizarse internamente de manera de abordar incertidumbres y posibles problemáticas. Nosotros tenemos un procedimiento de consulta. Aquí el analista de riesgo elabora la evaluación de riesgo y entra a un proceso de consulta interna en que se consulta con otras unidades de nuestra ONPF, entre ellas la unidad normativa, la unidad de vigilancia donde distintas personas con expertise y experiencia en el desarrollo o en los productos que se están evaluando, opinan y dan sus observaciones y comentarios al respecto. Luego debe comunicarse al país exportador y a la comunidad internacional antes de entrar en vigencia por las vías institucionales existentes. Y esa es la última, la siguiente, por favor, la última. Esa es mi presentación. Les agradezco la oportunidad y su atención. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ms. Ibanez Olat. I will now give the floor to Dr. David Dale, Principal Scientific Analyst of the Biosecurity Plant and Science Services Division of the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, to present on maintaining a BMSB-free Australia, assessments and practices. Dr. Dale, you have the floor.
Thank you. Firstly, can I please check that I can be heard?
The quality of your voice is not quite good, but do you have any other equipment?
Thank you. Is that an improvement?
This is still the same.
Still the same? Yes, hold on a moment, please. Is that better now? Is that an improvement?
It's a little bit better, but maybe you can continue. If we have any problem, we'll let you know.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Australia's approach to international standards and best practices in pest risk identification, assessment and management. Australia takes biosecurity both as an importing country and an
Dr. Dale?
Yeah. Yes.
The quality of your sound is not good enough for translation. So maybe you just don't use your headset or use other
Thank you.
ways.
I'll take my headset off. Hold on. Can you hear me now?
It's even worse.
Is that any better?
No, it's not better.
Goodness, apologies, I don't know what more to do.
Hi, Dr. Dale, would you like to check the screen, the left down corner? There is a microphone, an icon of microphone. Check it and select SAM Assistant. You are muted.
Is that better?
We can hear you now, but the quality is not better.
I will come very close. Is that better now?
It's louder, and I think you can continue.
Thank you. I am very close to my screen now. Thank you. I'll just quickly start from where I left off. Australia takes biosecurity both as an importing country and an exporting country extremely seriously, and it has robust regulatory system that supports this position. Today I'll briefly illustrate some elements of Australia's biosecurity system using as a case study our continuing efforts to keep Australia free of brown marmorated stink bug, BMSB, and in parallel, other seasonal hitchhiking bugs. Next slide, please. For those who aren't familiar with BMSB, a very brief introduction. It's a native of Southeast Asia, which has unfortunately become widespread in the Northern Hemisphere over previous decades, now spread widely across Europe and North America. It's a serious production pest of orchards and other horticulture, and also an amenity pest in households. It has a number of hitchhiker pest attributes. Very importantly, it aggregates in small niches, crevices and spaces prior to the onset of winter. It then diapauses and emerges when temperatures rise again. It feeds for a few weeks, then mates and begins its life cycle. Unfortunately, it likes to also aggregate in goods that are left outside, into which it can gain access, and so stowaway aggregations pose significant risk once they enter warmth, such as in the Southern Hemisphere summer. BMSB is not present in Australia, but as we'll see, there are many interceptions at the border. There are also other similar bugs, such as the yellow spotted stink bug you see illustrated on the bottom right, and the situation is complicated by the presence in Australia of many superficially similar native species, such as the one on the bottom left-hand side. Next slide, please. A history in brief, that in response to a significant increase in interceptions in year 2014 in break bulk cargo, that is large machinery coming from the US, Australia initiated emergency measures in 2015 consistent with ISPM 13. These were progressively adapted as required as instances of the bug spread, and a pest risk analysis was finalised and released in December 2019, consistent with ISPM 1. We now have ongoing measures to support safe trade, importantly targeting these measures to minimise the impacts of trade while maintaining biosecurity, again consistent with ISPM 1. We also routinely and continually inform domestic and international stakeholders of changes to the conditions, and you can see a URL there which anyone in the world can access. We're also continually working to enhance our ability to detect and identify BMSB as well as other hitchhiking entertainment bug pests. Next slide, thank you. As I mentioned, Australia is keen to minimise the impacts of the measures, and it does this in a number of ways. It firstly imposes seasonal measures which apply only to targeted goods that are manufactured in or shipped from identified risk countries during a stipulated risk time window. It also applies measures to sea vessels that berth, load or transship from target risk countries within that same period. So just to elaborate a little on this, it's useful to think of this as something of a matrix approach. There are 38 target risk countries identified, unfortunately including all of Europe as well as Russia, the USA and Canada, and 2 emerging risk countries, a separate category being the UK and China, for which slightly separate measures are applied. Goods themselves are divided into 2 categories: target high-risk goods, which are based around 23 tariff classifications, international tariff classifications, including articles of wood, stone, ceramic composition, and types of break bulk cargo. Again, that is large machinery items and railway cars, dump trucks, and so on. Target risk goods, a second category, include 9 tariff classifications, and these include articles of plastics, rubber, and paper. So, and then combined with the country designations, target high-risk goods from target risk countries are subject to mandatory offshore treatment before they're allowed entry to Australia. The second category, target risk goods from target risk countries, so not high risk, but target risk goods from high target risk countries are subject to random inspection on arrival in Australia. I know this is a rather complicated description, and if you're interested, I urge you to look at the website where it's set out in a bit more detail. But again, I stress that these measures are put in place both to keep Australia safe, but to minimise the impact as far as possible. Next slide, please. The ability to detect these small bugs in very large items of equipment is quite difficult, and we use multiple means to do this. On vessels in transit, crew must do inspections, and there are also mandatory inspections on berthing of vessels in Australia. Since the year 2018, Australia has very successfully used detector dogs to actually detect BMSB. Detector dogs are widely used in Australian points of entry to detect a range of animal and plant materials, as well as other pests such as BMSB. And through these means, significant numbers of BMSB detections have been made at the Australian border. You can see in season 2020 to 21, there were 232 detections, and in the following season, 21 to 22, that's the one just concluded in 30th of June, there were 158 detections. Now, these are not the numbers of bugs, these are the number of incidents in which bugs were found. So, as you can see, there's quite a high approach rate to Australia. I'm pleased to say that the majority of these were detections of dead bugs in treated articles. There were probably around 10% were live on arrival. Next slide, thank you. Australia is actually working on ways to improve the detection and identification of BMSB and other hitchhiking bug pests, and has recently developed a new mobile phone app. The DAF is my department, Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries, and CSIRO is our national science organisation, has used artificial intelligence model with biologically identified and verified specimens to actually come up with a means of recognising top and underside views of 45 stink bug species, including BMSB, other pentatomed bugs, exotic bugs to Australia, as well as differentiating them from common Australian native bugs. These mobile apps are currently in field trials and with the aim of providing low-cost automated portable solution to assist in rapid identification, in triage of suspected cases of exotic bug pests, and in all of those cases there is a follow-up of a detection with a laboratory confirmation. Next slide, thank you. Finally, my last slide, again, a detector dog detecting bugs in break bulk cargo. You can see the size of these machinery that Australia imports for various uses in mining and so on. And there is a website there, the BMSB Hub for Australia, if you would like to get any more details about BMSB and through that of the procedures that we use in Australia for pest risk identification and management. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dale. The floor is now open for a second round of questions related to the last three presentations from Ms. Anderson, Ms. Ibanez Olat, and Dr. Dale. Are there any questions? Maybe I can ask a question to Dr. Dale. Sorry? Oh. I see the flag of Chinese Taipei. Chinese Taipei, you have the floor online, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. My question goes to Ms. Helen Anderson. Thank you for your excellent sharing. I would like to know, when you are identifying the phytosanitary concerned pest, your horizon scanning approach include social media like Twitter. Could you share more detail about the scanning method and the process? And how do you make sure that the information on social media is correct? Thank you.
Thank you, Chinese Taipei. Is there any questions or comments? Or I can have a question to Dr. Dale. The app for identifying BMSB is very fancy and interesting. So even though it's still in field trial, do you have any plan to expand the coverage of the pest? Thank you. So now we have two questions. One is to Ms. Anderson and one is to Dr. Dale. I would like to invite Ms. Anderson first. You have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the question. So you are correct. We do use Twitter to help sort of with the horizon scanning. We don't have a formal or a best described as a sort of a technological way of monitoring Twitter. What we have is we have signed up to various Twitter accounts and to monitor various and to look at sort of things that come on various Twitter accounts of organizations who also have interests in plant health, pests, and who might sort of post about sort of extra information if there are any particular findings. Particularly in the UK, we do monitor if there are anything anything comes up on any amateur findings, for example. In terms of making sure the information is correct, we would always go to look for original sources for this and to actually contact individuals to see if what the information actually is, if that makes sense. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. May I invite Dr. Dale? You have the floor.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for your question. Yes, this the mobile app is viewed as a platform technology that, for which BMSB is providing the proof of concept. And there are plans for the next extension to be for exotic bee species in Australia, where once again we have a large number of native bee species, and we also have pest pressure from species such as Apis cerana and other exotic bees, which potentially can carry the varroa mite very destructive varroa mite, which is a pest from which Australia currently is free. It is, although there has been an incursion which is currently under eradication. There's constant pressure from arrival of exotic bees on ships in particular coming into the country. So yes, we do expect to continue to develop that app for other applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dale. With this, we come to the end of session 3. And I understand that Mr. Philippe Binard is with us in the meeting room today, and he is going to catch an early flight in this afternoon. So would you like to make your presentation earlier now? Thank you. So I would first give the floor to Mr. Philippe Binard, General Delegate of Fresh Fall Europe, to present practical problems with phytosanitary trade conditions. Mr. Binard, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the flexibility and also for inviting representatives of the private sector. So you can go to the next slide. So my name is Philippe Binard. I'm based in Brussels and representing an organization which represents the whole supply chain. So we have members which are on the production down to the retail, and we represent, if you could show the slide, and we represent basically about 70 million tons of fruit and vegetables which are produced for the fresh market in Europe. They are, and I could refer to the presentation of Aria Reis before. If you could go the one, yeah, we have about 40 million tons which move between the different member states. So fruit and vegetables are primarily a local product, sell on the country where it has been grown, but then there are some movement and also an important international component. The EU is the larger importer in the world for fruit and vegetable, fresh fruit and vegetable, and we have also some export which amount to about 7 million tons. If you could go to the next one so that we could enter into the topic. When we look where plant health is in the level of the discussion or on the agenda of the sector, I think we could say that there have been in the last 10 years or 15 years significant step towards more responsibility, more commitment in terms of plant health. We do realize that we need a sound production to have the diversity of product to meet also the health benefit for the sector. So we are sure that we can take also all the societal concern on the agenda, taking care of biodiversity, enhancing environment, adapting also to climate change, which have quite an important impact on the evolution of pest and disease. And this is why also there is quite a lot of research and innovation which are in the sector, also to address another element which is definitely a tendency that we have in the last year with the reduction of the toolkit available for the protection, with the reduction of plant protection product available to cope with societal concern, but also it's not only coming from the legislation, it's also coming from the customer. And then I think there have been raising awareness. There have been a lot of things happening. There have been the reform of the plant health regime. There have been the International Year on Plant Health, which have stimulated the discussion and the concern about plant health. And obviously, there is no trade if there is not a sound production. So that's a little bit for the mindset in the sector. And I think when we look at what has been presented this morning, I think from the WTO SPS agreement, also from the trade facilitation, from the contribution of the IPPC, I think there are some news that could be setting a positive background for having sound production and safe trade with rules that should be science-based, that should be proportionate, non-discriminatory, justifiable, risk-based, non-trade distortive, feasible, and timely. So I think this should normally give a balance and a proportional way of developing the business. If you move to the next one, which will show that maybe the reality is a little bit different, and it's certainly quite challenging. I will more present here because the EU is also a large importer, and the rule on import has been presented by Ari Arez from DG Santé earlier this morning. I will look more at the perspective from the challenge that we have from an exporting country, so for the 7 million tons which are exported. So I think the first element is that while the EU is operating on an open system, and a number of other countries operate on that basis, in most of the countries where we export, we are confronted with a closed system, not always very transparent to get access to the information. Of course, in the biggest country, it's easier to have access, but for smaller markets, it's not always easy in terms of languages, in terms of access to the information on the internet. I think when there are negotiations, the common rules that has been indicated before in the EU system are sometimes ignored when there are discussion, and we could say sometimes that this could be misused, maybe for protectionist purposes. And in general, on the negotiation, it takes time. There are a lot of delay, and it's not always easy to adapt the mitigation measure based on the reduction of the plant protection product recently, and also the coherence between different policy, because here we focus on plant health, but I think we have to look at other elements which have to be combined, which is food safety, which is the sustainability development with all its different factors, the farm-to-fork debate that we have at the European level. And then once, let's say, the access is granted, there are still a number of implementation challenge due to fragmentation, maybe the repetition which is needed for the assessment on a variety basis. So if an agreement is already existing for one variety of one product, a kiwi, let's say, for green kiwi, it has also then to be adapted for the yellow kiwi or for the baby kiwi. Sometimes it's difficult to understand. And each of these processes are time-consuming in terms of human resource. And time-consuming, it's not only for those of you who are in this room, which make the work, but also for the sector to provide the necessary information, which need to be multiplied depending on the number of country of destination. I think there is also now more and more, because there are a lot of dossiers pending for everyone, the need of prioritization, which is sometimes very subjective and sometimes penalizing some of the product from the trade. Maybe the bigger product have more access to the market than smaller product, which cannot conduct the same work or cannot be higher in the priority list. And at the end, we have protocols sometimes that are signed and signed also based on the approval of the sector. But we see sometimes some of the protocol, given the number of requirements, as more a discouragement that therefore lead to a prevention of export for the sector. And I think we have also in all the process to take into account that we handle products which are perishable and which have small margin, which therefore make sometimes difficulty to have all the investment which is needed. If you move to the next slide. And then I was talking about protocols. I think we export from the EU to 145 destinations. It means that they are expertise, that they are willingness to develop the exporting market. I think there is obviously always a preference to sell the product on the EU market, but it's a fact of life that maybe 95% of potential customers are outside the European Union. So we have always to look a little bit what is out there, also to balance the market between different opportunity. And on the road to market access, we are often confronted with problem of human resource that I've just mentioned before, excessive delays. it's not unusual that sometimes an application can take up to 10 years. There are some kind politicization, so the whole dossier can be technically concluded, but then there is still the nitty-gritty difficulty of politicization of the dossier before its publication. Then the difficulty of the non-recognition of the EU as a single entity, which means that it's very difficult sometimes to bundle some of the protocol negotiation for pests which are very similar. And the surprise that sometimes, therefore, if there is individual negotiation, it could lead to different solutions for the same pest and the same condition. But different outcome of the discussion and the requirements which have to be applied. I think as a sector, we would favor to have more standard to facilitate the process. I think that will facilitate the process for everyone, for the NPPO, for the sector, to have a better guideline about what needs to be applied in terms of length of a treatment which are accepted and how it has to be implemented. And we must say that sometimes for if we were talking about the international standard from the WTO SPS, when there is also an FTA signed by the EU with a specific SPS chapter, it's not always fastening or facilitating the process. If you could give me the next slide. So I think when we look at this, it's not only something that we could look only at the production. I think when we take a safe production and a safe trade, I think it includes different elements: managing an outdoor environment for production in orchard, managing an indoor environment, because there are some of the products which are grown indoors and which can be traded internationally. There is the management of the cold treatment, which implies also the cooperation with logistic service provider, for instance, for in-transit cold treatment on ships. The management of the storage, which is not always easy, depending on the protocol. There might be segregation of the consignment before departure in a cold store, and when there are small volume, that could then not optimize the facility of a packing station or a storage. Then I think there are also the necessity to be depending on the protocol, there are not always the facility to respond to a market opportunity, because sometimes it's more than 6 months in advance that we have to identify the orchard, that we have to identify the packing station. And it's not that there might be more risk, but if someone, and there are more and more climatic havoc, in a country will not have its crop, it's very difficult to be reacting, and this could lead to some lost opportunity. I think I've mentioned also the VSO inspection, because I think that's something which, with the COVID crisis, has been developing, and that might be something which could help reducing the cost of the control in the future. So it's definitively seen as an added value, but there might be sometimes some technical problem that might need to be overcome. If you move the next slide. And I think that's a little bit mentioning what I've indicated before regarding the protocol, whether they are made for export or for not exporting because of the discouragement. I think it's in the execution of a protocol, there are sometimes the feeling that there are excessive planning, a lot of pre-clearance still, which mean maybe not full confidence in the NPPO in charge of the control for the export in the third country, and pre-clearance lead to cost. And when there are limited volume at stake, it's sometimes a little bit difficult. The problems with the treatment, because now there are more and more products that are banned, and that is impacting the mitigation measures. So I think we have to find new tools, maybe with biopesticide, and secure the same level of confidence. The fact that we often see from the European side that there might be for an identical Pest different SPS requirements, which is always very surprising to see how we can do that. And well, resource, I've talked about it, but also I think sometimes it's very difficult to adapt the list, because every year there is a need to update the list of region, of maybe variety, orchard, and this might be time consuming. If you could move to the next slide. And then the complexity mean that sometimes there is some opaqueness in the way the system is working. The requirements might be excessive. There might be quite a number of cumulative requirements, and it's more a tick box, and if one is not rightly ticked, it might lead to a failure of recognition. I think the relative rigidity that we have in the protocols 1.6, because they are evolution of orchard, they are evolution of variety, and sometimes it might be blocked in the evolution of the product range that could be made available. And then I think today, I think we are all suffering across the world about rising costs, and sometimes we could say that managing all this procedure could cost between 15 to 20 cents per kilo, which is relatively high, considering that sometimes the cost of production can be about 30 to 50 cents depending on the product. So the part which has to be added for the monitoring might be worth, because it leads way to market access, but it's sometimes proportionally not realistic to be taken into account, and therefore it can refrain from the decision to go on international trade. And I think, and my last remark is that there are around the different countries a lot of demand, so there are an interest to be developing and boosting trades which can offer a diversification of product to consumer around the world, but the process is timely, and therefore there are sometimes the difficult choice to say where do we want to prioritize a dossier. If you can move to the last one, and I guess I'm coming a little bit to the end. So I think how do we see the way forward? Definitively, I think, and it might be surprising when we represent different countries, which are all competitors, but I think we all see the benefit of synergies or working together. I think our members from the different countries work together on their market access difficulty. They compare the rule, and I think it's important that we move more and more to equal treatment for all EU export, bearing in mind, obviously, the differences that might occur in the different orchards across Europe. I think we see the benefit of boosting digitalization, not only for the control, but also for the phyto certificate, because that could help to reduce administrative mistake. I think there should be more discipline in agreeing timeline and procedure for the dossier. Having dossier which last for 10 years are definitely not understandable or even acceptable. I think there should be confidence in the work that are done prior to exporter, and at the end we are here with an obligation of result, and I think we should avoid to have all these pre-authorization. I think a long term we see the benefit of developing science-based international standard. I think that could facilitate a lot the work in the discussion and avoid to secure more that it is scientifically basis, and that we don't always have to reinvent the wheel, and to build the sound, the safe and the fair trade, implementing existing protocol. And I think that will be my next and last slide. I think there are already a number of tools available, and the question really and my message is to see how we can best take the benefit of what is there and make sure that it is implemented within the spirit of the different principles that I mentioned it at the beginning of the presentation. So I stop here because I had about 10 minutes, and I hope that it's maybe soon time to have the lunch break. I am there for with my contact details if you have questions. And I would like to thank again the chairman and the WTO for inviting the private sector to be at this meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Binard. The QA session on Mr. Binard's presentation will be in the afternoon. Will be, I was informed that if you have any question to Mr. Binard, you can raise it now, or you have any other comments. The floor is open. The EU, please.
Mr. Binard, from an industry perspective, can you identify a handful of priority products or commodities in global trade for which you would appreciate streamlined procedures particularly?
Well, maybe your question is a little bit tricky because I think there are more energy and international trade on the big products, being apple, pears, kiwi, citrus. These are the products. When you look at the, I could add onions also, that the EU is trading internationally. But I think there are also some niche products which have more difficulty than to go through the process that I have been mentioning, and where there are also nice opportunity to diversify, because there might be more product in being vegetables, but also some smaller segment of fruit, which sometimes doesn't have the capacity to go through the opening of the market. That could work when we go to the EU neighborhood, which operate with a relatively similar system. So for our export to Switzerland, Norway, the UK, or even some of the North African countries like Egypt, it's relatively simple and we don't need to go to a complex process. But when we look more internationally, to go to Southeast Asia, which is gaining momentum for our export, some of the other Asian countries, and also to some of the export to the Americas in general, from north to south, they are more complex systems which need to imply time-consuming and a lot of costs before having the right to consider trading.
Thank you, Mr. Binard. Is there any further question or comments? I see. Oh, the United States, you have the floor.
Thanks. And I appreciate having the private sector here. For me and anybody who knows that how I've been involved in these thematic sessions, I always think it's important to have folks here from the private sector, because that's obviously the group that is heavily impacted by the work we do here. It's not much of a question. It's more of perhaps an observation, or I'll use observation. I think that the perspective of the private sector is generally the same in each of the countries where we all work, which is to say, I've heard it now twice that say that the European market is relatively open and other markets are closed, and I think that that's probably not a terribly helpful categorization. I think that across the board, all countries have similar factors that they have to weigh in terms of protecting their animal health, plant health, and food safety. And it just was a point to say that I understand that it can be frustrating on the part of the private sector, but I think those frustrations are shared probably across all countries, and it's just a good reminder for those of us in this committee that the perspectives of our domestic stakeholders are very strong, but it's probably not helpful to think of broad groups of countries as having closed markets versus open markets, because we all have respective challenges in the way we try and address those things. Thanks.
Thank you, the United States. I also see the flag of Zambia. Zambia, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that presentation from Fresh Air. I just wanted to find out, have you had any or experiences or difficulties with electronically generated phytosanitary certificates? And maybe this also goes to the EU. I'm asking this because there are times as a country we've experienced situations where consignments have been intercepted because of electronically generated phytosanitary certificates, sometimes insisting for manual or handwritten phytosanitary certificate. This is despite notifications done concerning the use of these electronically generated phytosanitary certificate. And the unfortunate thing is that it's not very consistent. Sometimes they intercept, sometimes these consignments are not intercepted. Have you had any experiences with regards to that? Thank you.
Thank you, Zambia. Mr. Pinard, you have the floor.
Well, I will respond from the private sector, so not from those who make the control, but when we look at the overall non-compliance on import, we roughly have 1/3 which are relating to interception of pest, 1/3 relating to certificates which are not correct, and there is 1/3 relating to wood packaging. And I think therefore the 1/3 relating to administrative difficulty should be addressed. One of the ways to address that is to move more rapidly to the e-phyto system, because I think the digitalization would avoid a number of technical mistakes that are in the documents. I think it's quite important, and maybe this afternoon there will be other speakers who will be referring to that, but that's a way to improve. At the end, and for your last remark, the controls are made by people, so I think the way one can be interpreting a document can be different depending of the workload, depending of the different point of entry. So that could happen. We don't say that this is the rule, and we have full confidence that the control which are made are according to the principle and the spirit of the legislation. There is at the European level now, since 2018, common rules with the official control system which is in place, and that has helped to have a better harmonization of the control at the point of entry.
Thank you, Mr. Pinard. With this, we come to the end of the morning session, and please remind you that the afternoon session starts at 3:15 p.m. I think everybody is hungry, so we need more time to have our lunch. So the morning session is closed now. Thank you.